The Second Sino-Japanese War that took place from 1937 to 1945 was a vicious, sprawling conflict that continues to deeply affect foreign relations between China and Japan today. Millions were mobilized with major battles as epic as those taking place elsewhere during World War II in Stalingrad, Kursk, or at the Battle of the Bulge. Yet it is difficult to find information in English about what happened. Perhaps we can take a look at these battles in a future video, but today we want to visit a deliberate, self-inflicted disaster by the Chinese Nationalist government, the flooding of the Yellow River in 1938. This horrid incident, made in desperation and approved by nationalist leader Chiang Kai-Shek, killed hundreds of thousands outright, displaced millions more across the Yellow River Plain, and sparked a major famine in 1942 that killed yet thousands more. It had limited to significant strategic effect, but caused pain and suffering for years to come. The event is largely forgotten today, so many have died without fanfare. The Chinese Han people first emerged on the banks of the Yellow River, and as one of the two great rivers in China, it has been celebrated but feared for thousands of years. This majestic but turbulent river is named as such because it is often full of silt. During certain times of the year, it is apt to flood, overflowing its banks and wreaking havoc upon millions of people. Great floods have caused famine and killed millions. Controlling the river has been one of the fundamental tasks of the Chinese government. Whenever the river breaks its boundaries and creates its floods, it is taken as a sign of impending collapse of the dynasty, a sign that the current administration has lost the mandate of heaven. The flooding of the Yellow River had been used before for warfare purposes, all with rather iffy results. In The Romance of the Three Kingdoms, the famous novel, Guan Yu uses a deliberate flooding to defeat his rival Cao Cao's forces in year 219 at the city of Fancheng. It did not work in the long run as he was captured and executed. Another historical example, Northern Song officials breached the river in 1128 to try to defeat incoming Jurchen Jin forces conquering the north. And then the Ming dynasty breached the river too to try to preserve the dynasty as it began to fall and give way to the Qing. None of these worked, but sort of like with an open marriage, you always kind of think your case is going to be different. Considering the circumstances, you would really only breach the Yellow River if you were truly desperate, and to be fair, that is exactly how you would describe the circumstances of the Chinese Nationalist government in 1938. The Japanese have been conquering land across China for the better part of a decade, first Manchuria in 1931, and then parts of northern China a year later, and it seemed like they were set on taking the whole lot. China did not have international allies to help defend itself, and Chiang Kai-shek intentionally ignored the Japanese incursions so to consolidate power and wrestle influence away from the burgeoning Communist Party. Finally, though, the two parties created a united front and battled Japan together. But they were losing. By early 1938, Nanjing had brutally and grotesquely fallen, and the Japanese were marching on Suzhou, a key rail junction. Though there, they planned to move to Zhengzhou and then to Wuhan, taking on 200,000 Japanese troops. With the 600,000 he had from the Nationalist Army, Chiang Kai-shek failed to stop the Japanese at Suzhou in a 3-week battle at Taiyuan. At the end of the battle on April 7, Chiang Kai-shek's forces were surrounded, and there were no one else north of the Yangtze to stop the Japanese advance. The government was based in Wuhan, and they were desperately trying to evacuate as many people as it could to the relative safety of the West. But they needed time. They needed something to delay the Japanese army. It is likely that the Yellow River flood idea first came from Qin Chuan, commander of the First War Zone, and Chen Qingzhou, Minister of War. But in the end, Chiang Kai-shek made the final decision, and indeed on June 4th, a telegram came from him to the troops of the 53rd Army to breach the dikes that had held back the river. And the first attempt was made that very day. Nobody in the military opposed him. Nobody looked at a map to see where the waters would go or tried to evacuate people. And apparently nobody thought about the long-term consequences of breaching a river known for killing millions of people during the peak of the harvest season across one of the most densely populated areas in the world. But then again, we have to keep in mind, the Japanese forces were just 25 miles from Zhengzhou, and the government was desperate. They needed anything to stop the Japanese. 3 attempts were made to breach the dike. The first 2 were made at Dongmo County, Henan Province, just west of Zhengzhou. The atmosphere was tense, but the Japanese were right across the river on the northern banks of the river. The first attempt was made from June 4th to June 6th at a location called Zhaoko. The dike was hollowed out and then blown up with explosives. The work was done overnight and without lights because the Japanese would try to shell them from across the river. But this attempt failed. The dike was quite strong at this particular location. It was just bad luck. June 7th, attempt number 2, again done at Zhaoko and with explosives, but it failed again. Everyone was under immense tension and pressure now. June 9th, a third attempt, now at a location to the west of the first two attempts, called Huayankou. Soldiers cut away at the dike with spades, hoes, drills, and hammers. The river broke, slowly at first, but then faster and faster. Soon, 75% of its waters were breaking across the farmlands. The military men there warned the local magistrate of Zhongmo, but no one else. The people of that local area would be able to get to higher ground and survive the initial flooding, but the other districts were unreachable. There were no loudspeakers, there were no radios back then, and many of those people would be caught unaware and would drown in the flood waters over the coming days. For those who survived, though, the horror was just beginning. The flood water spilled across the northern China plain. The original goal was to cut the Longhai railway line and prevent the Japanese from going any further, and it did that for sure, but the waters kept on going, moving out to the Huai River, flooding southeast Henan. From there, it entered the Huai River, easily overflowing it and cutting the nearby Jinpu railway line. The waters then from there poured into the Hongzi Lake, overflowing that too, and exploding into Jiangsu. From there, it split into 3 streams towards the ocean. The northernmost stream flowed across the Jiangsu plain. The middle went across the old Yellow River bed, where the river used to be before a devastating 1855 flood. And the third stream broke the Grand Canal, and then flooded east of Jiangsu. Like I said before, nobody within the war room apparently anticipated that the waters would do all of this, but anyone with a topological map, though to be honest, this also was not a given, could have made that prediction. The river waters had taken the exact same pathway during the 1887 flood that killed nearly 1 million people. The toll was devastating. Flooding covered 32% of the fields in eastern Henan. Survivors recalled the sight and smell of drowned, bug-covered corpses floating in the water, the experience of crowding onto dikes, the only high ground in the area, with other survivors, and witnessing people trapped in the water drowning while waiting for rescue boats that never came. Over 100 million tons of silt poured onto the farmlands, making them basically unusable. Outside a city called Xihua, survivors recall the silt coming in as high as the wall, and inside, 4 huge ponds in the 4 corners of the city, running right up to the city main streets, with deserted houses standing in the water. The silt had come up to the houses' windows and even higher. The silt had major effects on food production. Grain production in Henan fell by 50% from 1936, and after the waters receded, survivors were confronted with the fact that there was nothing to eat. Land that had once been richly fertile was now nothing but a desert of silt, and when that desert dried, then the ground was hard as brick. Vines and grasses could grow in the silt deserts, but nothing else. The disaster victims, forced to come down from the high grounds because they had nothing to eat, salvaged little but grass. Then the locusts came, as they always do during this time of year, but without anything to hold them back, they swarmed out of control. The wet conditions made diseases like malaria rampant. Farmers would find that they could not make a living or survive where they lived, and they would be forced to tear down their homes or flee, and many did flee, up to 90% of the population. So what were the strategic gains of the action? There is no way around it. This was an immense mistake by the nationalist government, and the gains did not outweigh the costs. Not a single Japanese soldier died in the flood, as they were far out of range, nor did they lose anything of material gain. The flood did not stop their eventual takeover of Wuhan either, and as they eventually floated up the river and took over the city in October 1938. What the flood did do for the Chinese was to buy them 5 months of breathing space, from June to October, and gave them a small buffer zone that protected certain cities in the floodlands that did not get flooded themselves. And politically, it was a real disaster for the Kuomintang, the party in control of the Chinese government, as this area would become a fertile breeding ground for the Communist Party for decades to come. And now for the big number. How many people died? And it depends on the source, and I don't have any images here, but here's what I was able to dig up. Communist sources early in the 1950s were inflated over time as it became more politically expedient to make the Kuomintang look as bad as possible. And at the time, you would actually find that the CCP seems to have been in support of the breach. They would only turn against the Kuomintang in 1946 after the war was over. The CCP in the 1950s found 470,000 dead and 6 million displaced. But by the 1970s, that number had turned into 890,000 dead and 12.5 million displaced. And that number remains the official communist position today. A Japanese study from 1994 found 900,000 dead and 10 million displaced. A Taiwanese study in 1995, based on Nanjing sources, found 400 to 500,000 dead and 3 million refugees. The reality is that there is no true number to look at. The government by then had become a miserable mess, with no one to take counts before or after the floods. And the national government, in the end, would try to fix the breach several times after 1938. They finally managed to close it in March 15, 1947. The government held a lavish ceremony at Huayankou to celebrate its quote-unquote success. Chiang Kai-Shek gave a speech commending the workers and remembering the soldiers who died during the project. 2 years later, he and the rest of his government had fled the mainland to Taiwan.